Welcome.
Oh, hello.
How are you, my friend? I'm so glad you could be here with us. I'm fine, thank you. And welcome to everyone, our faculty, staff, students, and our distinguished guests. Welcome to the Innocence Project, Reflections on Wrongful Imprisonment. My name is Susan Madera. I'm Program Specialist for the High Impact Strategies for the Freshman Academies. This semester, 950 Queensborough students are reading To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, and 950 high school students in the area are also reading the book at the same time. They also will have access to the 15 co-curricular events that we have offered the past 2 weeks, and this the final week of the Common Read. I'd like to thank the Office of Academic Affairs for their support of this event, and the faculty and students who are participating in the Spring 2012 Common Read. Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird tells the story of Tom Robinson, a man convicted of a crime which he did not commit. Let's take a few minutes to watch a clip from the film as Atticus Finch, the attorney for the defense, asks the jury to do their duty and free Tom Robinson. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Jean Murley, Associate Professor in the English Department, who will introduce our guest speakers.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Professor Jean Murley, and I'm a professor in the English department here at Queensborough. It is my distinct honor and great pleasure to introduce our guest speakers for today. Our first speaker is, I believe, a real-life Atticus Finch. We just saw Atticus defending a wrongfully accused person, trying to defend him from being convicted, trying to stop him from being convicted. The work that our first speaker today does is much less Hollywood and less showy than that, but it's equally important work. She travels the country trying to reverse wrongful convictions and allowing people who have had that great misfortune to walk free from their prison cells. So she is going to give you a presentation today about wrongful conviction and about the work that she does with the Innocence Project. Our second speaker is a wrongfully convicted man. He did 18 years in numerous New York State prisons for a murder that he did not commit. And he's going to tell his story, and hopefully you'll make some connections between the book that you're studying, To Kill a Mockingbird, and these actual events that happen. There are some brochures up here about the Innocence Project and a couple of posters, and we're going to be circulating a sign-up sheet for the Innocence Project's email list, so that if you are interested in learning more about this work and these problems in our society and our criminal justice system, you can get more information about it. So without further comments, let me introduce our first speaker, Olga Akselrod.
Hi, everybody. My name is Olga Akselrod. I am a staff attorney at the Innocence Project here in New York. And the Innocence Project is an organization that was founded in 1992 by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld. We started off as basically a class, a law school class, 2 professors and a lot of very dedicated students. Working to represent people who claimed that they were wrongfully convicted. And in the intervening years, We have expanded to a totally separate non-for-profit. We have 50 employees now, including lawyers such as myself, policy analysts, fundraisers, media people, you name it. And we still run a legal clinic at Cardozo, so students are still really at the heart of what we do at the Innocence Project. We work nationwide, as Jean mentioned. We have clients all over the country. And we're not the only Innocence Project. We are the first Innocence Project, but as a result of our work, people have been inspired to do this all over the country. And there's now around 45 Innocence Projects throughout the country and others throughout the world. And we are loosely affiliated in something that we call the Innocence Network. So this is really a movement, for lack of a better word. So what do we do? The Innocence Project really has two missions, litigation and policy reform. So on the litigation side of things, that's what I do as an attorney. I represent people in court who've been wrongfully convicted, and specifically people for whom DNA testing can potentially prove innocence. The New York project only does DNA cases. Other projects do non-DNA evidence as well, but that's what we focus on. So that's number one. That's one of our missions, to represent the wrongfully convicted and to get them out of prison. But we also have another mission, which is policy reform, and that's to work to actually reform the system to address the causes that led to the wrongful conviction in the first place. And these two missions are intertwined, and they are both equally critical. Just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, this is Scotty Fapiano, who was exonerated after 21 years in prison for a rape in Brooklyn that he did not commit. On the left, you see Scotty with his attorney, Nina Morrison, on the day that he was released after 21 years. His exoneration returned to him his freedom. It returned to him his name. It brought him back home. But like all exonerations, Scotty's was also a lesson. This was a lesson, in his case, in the problems with eyewitness identifications. And his exoneration gave us an opportunity to talk about that, to educate people about the problem of wrongful convictions. And you really see Scotty, you know, with all those cameras in front of him, doing it the second he walked out of prison, really. And then several weeks later, he's with our co-director, Peter Neufeld, speaking at a committee hearing about some of these problems. And it's really important that we do address both sides of this, both helping people who've been wrongfully convicted and doing the policy reform, for a couple of reasons. One reason is that it is extremely difficult to undo a wrongful conviction. The reality is that even with DNA testing, it's really hard. And if you don't have DNA, it's nearly impossible. And contrary to what most people think, because we watch a lot of CSI and all these cop shows, right, there actually isn't DNA left behind by a perpetrator in the vast majority of cases. We're talking about something like 10% of criminal cases. So it's just the tip of the iceberg. And so we at the Innocence Project are very aware of the reality that there are a lot of people sitting in prison who've been wrongfully convicted who we are never going to be able to get out. So that's the first thing. We can't undo all the wrongful convictions. We have to stop them from happening to begin with. And the other side of this is just the human toll of wrongful convictions. I'm assuming you'll hear a little bit about this from Fernando. But you know, we got Scotty out, but we couldn't return those 21 years to him. I mean, you can only imagine 21 years in prison. That was his entire adult life. So that pain that the wrongful conviction caused to him, to his family, to the victim's family, we can't undo that. And so it's really up to us to prevent the wrongful conviction from happening to begin with. So starting on the litigation side of things, we're totally overwhelmed. We have in our office 6 staff attorneys, including me, and we have about 300 cases on our docket. All over the country. We represent people all over the place. We have a lot of cases in New York, in Illinois, in Texas, but it's really everywhere. And most of our cases come directly to us from people writing to us from prison saying, please help me, I've been wrongfully convicted. And we have so many people writing to us that we have actually a backlog of people just waiting to hear from us as to whether or not we can represent them. We primarily, because we're a DNA project, do pretty horrific crimes. Most of the cases on my docket are rapes and homicides, because those are the kinds of cases where DNA is left behind. And when we are accepting a case, a lot of people say, how do you take in a case? How do you know which cases to take? Well, we try really hard to not judge whether we think the person is innocent or not at the time that we're screening these cases. Because the reality is that we've seen so many cases where people have been wrongfully convicted where they looked really guilty. But then we did the DNA testing and we found out that they weren't. So we try to not make that judgment. We just try to figure out, can DNA prove this one way or the other? If DNA can prove it and they're claiming they're innocent, then we want to get them that testing to see if they are indeed innocent. Whoa, sorry about that. So once we take on a case, we face a lot of hurdles. The biggest one, evidence preservation. This is a picture of an evidence storage room in New Orleans. How do we find evidence when it's stored like that? This is a real problem throughout the country, and believe it or not, New York City, right, the most advanced city in the world, has some of the worst evidence preservation practices that we have seen in this entire country, and it's nearly impossible to find evidence from people who've been convicted in New York. We have to close about 1/3 of our cases because we're not able to find the evidence. And you can only imagine how devastating that is for somebody who's been wrongfully convicted to find out that the evidence that is the key to their freedom has been lost forever or actually destroyed. A lot of times we can't even find the paperwork to prove whether or not it's been destroyed. So that is really, a big tragedy for us, and a reform that we also push, especially in New York, to really try to push proper evidence preservation and cataloging procedures on the authorities. Because if they're going to convict somebody and keep them in prison for life, you would hope that they would actually hold on to the evidence. We primarily litigate under DNA access laws that have been passed as a result of our work. We have them now in 48 states. But the reality is that this can take years sometimes of court battle just to get the DNA testing itself. So it's not easy, but we do persevere in a lot of cases. And what have the results been? So far, just to date, there have been 289 people in the United States who've been exonerated post-conviction by DNA testing. So we're not even talking about all the many, many people who've also been exonerated through non-DNA evidence like Fernando. This is just DNA, and it's 289 and counting. We're going to hit 300 this year, I almost guarantee it. So the numbers are really staggering. Even more frightening is that 17 of these 289 people served time on death row. So let's be really clear about what I'm saying here. They were convicted of a crime, a death crime, so it was murder. They were sentenced to die. They didn't die solely because they managed to get somebody to help them and get DNA testing to prove their innocence. Some of these guys came within days of execution. So that's something that, you know, we really need to think about when we have a death penalty in this country, just how often we actually get it wrong. These exonerations have been all over the country, 35 states and DC, as I said, a lot in New York, in Texas. And the racial disparities that we see in the criminal justice system in general, we also see with people who've been wrongfully convicted. 62% of exonerees are African American. Obviously, that is much higher than the proportion of African Americans in the population. And this is something that people ask, well, why is it so hard to get DNA testing? Why do prosecutors even fight you? This is why they ask that. They ask that because we've actually solved the case through the power of DNA testing, often through DNA databanks or through investigating alternate suspects. We've actually solved the case in almost half of these DNA exonerations. We've actually been able to figure out who really committed the crime. So DNA testing, it's a no-brainer, but people still fight us. So how many innocent people are in prison? You know, the reality is we don't know. We don't know because we're still doing cases from the 80s, the 90s. I have a case from 1969 on my docket. So it's really hard to figure out exactly how many people have been wrongfully convicted in this country when we're still just making our way through the DNA cases. There was a professor at Seton Hall who did a study that he thinks that it's somewhere around 5% of criminal convictions are of people who've been wrongfully convicted. And if that percentage doesn't sound high to you, think about if 5% of airplanes crashed. Whether you'd be willing to get into an airplane, and the kind of, you know, mass response that we as a society would have to a 5% airplane crash rate. So we don't know how many innocent people there are in prison. What we do know is that it's a huge problem, and we have to reform the system to prevent it. So what have we learned through all these cases? What have we actually learned about the causes of wrongful conviction? We've learned a lot. We've seen a lot of patterns in our cases of what actually leads to these mistakes. And I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit of detail. Eyewitness misidentification, that's one of the biggest ones. We've seen that in about 3/4 of our cases. Unvalidated or improper forensic science, again, a really big one. We see that in well over half. False confessions. People don't really believe that those actually happen, and yet we've seen false confessions in about 1/4 of our cases. And convictions based on snitches, informants, people who are lying in order to get some sort of benefit. We see that in about 15% of cases. What's not on this list, and it's because it's a little harder to quantify, is just plain old misconduct. We see prosecutorial and police misconduct in a lot of our cases, a lot. And what am I talking about here? I'm talking about failure to disclose exculpatory evidence. That's, you know, a really big one that we see. And on the flip side, poor defense attorneys, attorneys who do not investigate their cases, often because public defenders who are representing most of these guys don't have the resources to do it. So we see that a lot, and those are huge problems that we haven't figured out exactly how to address. These are some of the problems that we see that there are actually pretty easy reforms for, and reforms that we spend a lot of time pushing in various legislatures and directly in police departments. So starting off with informants, snitches, right? Everyone knows what a snitch is, right? It's somebody who talks to police. Well, we're talking about somebody who not only talks to the police or to the prosecutors, but actually gets a benefit for it. There are practically professional snitches who get arrested for a crime, they're in jail, they happen to find themselves lucky enough to be in jail with somebody who's been accused of a really serious crime, and they think to themselves, maybe I'll go to the police and I'll say that that person confessed to me, and then they'll give me a break if I testify against that person. Now, it sounds crazy, right? Because why in the world would our courts be as foolish as to allow somebody to give such patently unreliable testimony? And yet it happens all the time. Witnesses who are really given huge breaks on their cases, sometimes paid for their testimony. One person who some of you may have seen here, who's spoken at least once here, twice, Dewey Bozzella. He was convicted and spent 26 years in prison for a 1977 homicide based solely, and when I say solely, I'm serious here, solely on the testimony of two guys who got incredible deals on unrelated cases that they had in exchange for their testimony against them. That was it. And that was enough to put him away for 26 years. He luckily was exonerated just a couple of years ago based on non-DNA as well. This was a case where his attorneys uncovered all sorts of exculpatory evidence that the police and prosecutors just didn't turn over. And so he is now free. But it just shows you the dangers of relying on unreliable testimony. At minimum, what should happen is that if they're going to allow this kind of evidence into court, at minimum, the judges should be instructing juries about the dangers of these kinds of witnesses and should be very clear with the jury of the kind of incentives that these witnesses are getting, because a lot of times those incentives are not actually presented to the jury. False confessions. So as I mentioned, this is one that's really hard for people to wrap their heads around. I think that it's very difficult for anyone to understand how someone could falsely confess to a crime they did not commit. And yet we see it a lot. We've seen it in about a quarter of our cases. And to really understand this problem, what you have to understand is that the police are trained in a highly scripted technique for interrogation. It's a very powerful technique. It's designed to make the person feel hopeless and make them feel that a confession is their only option. And it's a technique that's really designed to be used on guilty people. If somebody committed the crime, then the interrogation is a very powerful way to get them to admit it. The problem is that it's such a powerful technique that it actually leads people to falsely confess as well. Just one of the many examples is a guy named Marty Tankleff, who falsely confessed to murdering his parents on Long Island. He was just 17 years old. He found his parents murdered in his home, called 911. The police decided that he was not exhibiting the kind of emotional response that they expected him to have, and they decided he was a suspect. And by the way, that's a very common thing to happen. The police think that people are supposed to react in a very specific way to trauma. People react in all sorts of different ways to trauma. They didn't like how Marty reacted. They threw him into the interrogation room, interrogated him for about 6-7 hours, and did something that a lot of people are shocked to hear police can do. They lied to him. They told him that his hair was found in his mom's hand. They even went so far as to tell him that his father woke up out of a coma and said Marty was the one that did this. His father never woke up out of a coma. That was just a total lie. The courts allow that. They say that that's okay. Police can lie to people when they're interrogating them. It's not really going to lead to somebody falsely confessing, and yet we know that it does. So Marty was finally released in 2008. It turned out in his case that the police officer investigating the case was likely involved in the murder, and that was another reason why they went after Marty, was because they wanted to cover up their own involvement. One of the big reforms that the Innocence Project really pushes is just to videotape the interrogation. And that's something that police are absolutely easily capable of doing in this modern age. The NYPD has actually recently started a pilot program where they are videotaping all homicide interrogations. So we are definitely making progress. When you have a videotape of an interrogation from beginning to end, you really have a record of what led to the confession. What kinds of information did the police include in their questions that led to the confession? And it's a very powerful tool, not only to show when somebody innocent has falsely confessed, but prosecutors actually love it because it's really powerful when somebody who did the crime confessed, to have that to show to the jury. So that's a reform that I really think is going to keep going and is going to really help the problem of false confessions quite a bit. Unvalidated or improper forensic science. So what are we talking about here? Well, it's really two different kind of things that we're talking about. One kind is the use of perfectly legitimate scientific techniques, real sciences, that just don't really belong in a courtroom. Before DNA, what they used to do was, if they had foreign biology from a suspect at the scene, they would do what was called ABO blood typing to it. People know what ABO blood typing is? Everybody knows their blood type, right? A, B, O, or you at least know that there is a blood type. Well, what they used to do is they used to do that test on the biology left behind by the perpetrator to figure out whether it was from an A person or an O person or a B person. Well, the problem is that, you know, there's like 45% of the population that has type O and another 45% that has type A. And that would still come into the courtroom. And so a jury would hear, oh, well, the perpetrator was a type O. Hey, it turns out the defendant is also a type O. And even though 45% of the people in the population are type Os, that little coincidence was enough to really sway a jury. So we see a lot of cases where people were included by serology testing, but when you did DNA on that biological material, it wasn't from them. So that's sort of like an old problem, right? That's the problem we see in our old cases. But we also have a problem with the kind of science that's coming into the courtroom today. And what I'm talking about here is, again, the kind of stuff that if you see CSI or, you know, any of these cop shows, you see them doing. You know, bite mark analysis, fiber analysis, even ballistics, right? You know, shooting the gun and seeing if the bullet came from the same gun. None of it has been scientifically tested, right? We all think that this stuff has been around forever. Even fingerprints haven't really been subjected to proper scientific study. So you compare something like DNA testing, well, that came out of medicine, it came out of hard sciences, biology. It's been studied for years and years before it ever made its way into the courtroom. Things like bite mark analysis, hair comparison, shoe print analysis, none of that was developed by scientists. That was developed by cops in a lab who sort of handed down, you know, the theories from person to person over the years, but none of it's been scientifically tested. So we very strongly believe that that stuff has to be scientifically tested. We're talking about taking the scientific hypothesis, right, and applying it to the forensics that come into our courtroom. That has to happen. There's been a lot of controversy about this lately. The National Academy of Sciences just did this huge report about this problem. So we are making some headway, but for now, there's a lot of stuff coming into the courtroom that's used to convict people that we just have absolutely no real belief that it's valid, and that's quite frightening. This is just another example of an exoneree, Dennis Fritz. He was sentenced to life. His co-defendant, Ron Williamson, was sentenced to death for a murder. They were exonerated in 2002. There were 18 hairs that the jury heard from a hair science expert were consistent with Fritz and Williamson on the victim's body. DNA testing was done post-conviction. It turned out none of the hairs were from them. About half the hairs were from the victim herself, and a bunch of the other hairs were from other people. So this was really powerful evidence that led to their conviction. It just wasn't true. And last but not least, eyewitness misidentification, a big one that we see in about a third of our cases. This is something that happens because of just how powerful eyewitness testimony is. You can only imagine how powerful it is for a jury to be sitting there and to hear a victim, point at the defendant and say, that's the person who did this to me. And the reality is that most of the time, they truly believe that. And the problem is that our memories are so fallible. They're not like video cassettes. I'm sure many people have had the experience of walking down the street and you think you recognize somebody, and as they get closer, it turns out you don't even know that person. Our memories are incredibly fallible. There's a lot of stuff that police can't control. They can't control how dark it was at the crime scene. They can't control how long the witness got to see the person that they're identifying. They can't do anything about that. Those are factors that affect how reliable an ID is, but they can't change it. What they can change is how they extract that memory from the witness. And really, we look at it as evidence that can be contaminated just like any other crime scene evidence. If you don't collect it properly, you're going to screw it up. I think everyone has seen, lineups on TV, right? This is a lineup picture. One of these guys is the suspect. They put in a bunch of other guys that are supposed to look like him, and the witness looks at him and says, it's number 4, it's number 5. Well, it turns out that that's a pretty suggestive way of doing it. It turns out that what often happens is that when people are viewing a lineup, they're not looking for the suspect, they're looking for the person who out of the 6 looks the most like the suspect. And that's partially how we get so many errors in eyewitness identifications. There are very simple things that police can do to prevent that. 2 really, one of them is make the thing double blind. So what that means is that the person administering the lineup doesn't know who the suspect is. We have a lot of cues that are given to witnesses, a lot of times unintentionally by police, who know who the actual suspect is in the lineup, and they, give them some cues, a lot of times unintentionally, that leads the witness to pick somebody. If the administrator of the lineup doesn't know who the suspect is, that's going to help a lot. And the other thing that's a little counterintuitive, but making them what's called sequential instead of simultaneous. This is a simultaneous lineup. Everyone's in the room at once. It turns out that if you have these guys come in one at a time into the room, the witness is a lot less likely to look at them and compare them against each other to see who looks the most like the suspect, and is much more likely to look at them and say, is the suspect in that lineup? So a pretty simple thing that police can do. I thought I would end by actually giving you one of the really great examples of the problem with eyewitness IDs, which is Fernando Bermudez. And I'm really excited that Fernando is here speaking with you today, because Fernando and I have never actually gotten the pleasure of speaking together. So very excited about it. But you're going to hear all about Fernando's story. But he spent 18 years in prison for a murder near Union Square that he didn't commit. And in Fernando's case, we have 2 different kinds of eyewitness misidentification problems, which we don't often see. One problem was you had a witness who was actually falsely identifying Fernando to cover for somebody else. He was lying, just plain lying, right? And that's something that we don't see that often. What we see more often is the other problem that we had in Fernando's case, which is witnesses who, they thought they were telling the truth. They just made a really tragic mistake. We had 4 people in Fernando's case who mistakenly identified him as the shooter. Why? Well, it comes back again to how police did the identification procedure. They took 4 people, all pretty young, I believe. Were they like teenagers? Teenagers, 4 teenagers. They put them in the room together with a bunch of mug books and said, here, see if you can find the guy, right? And you can only imagine, they're looking through, and as I understand it, the way Fernando's picture got picked was that one of the witnesses said, oh, this guy's cute. Look at this guy. And then they start looking at him and say, oh my God, wait, is that the shooter? Oh my God, wait, is that oh, that's the shooter, that's the shooter, right? That's actually how Fernando was convicted and spent 18 years in prison. Can that be prevented? Yes. Yes, that can be prevented. Had the eyewitness identification procedure been done properly, that wouldn't have happened. So these are problems that we can address. Just in closing, these are complicated issues. I don't want to make it sound like all of this is really simple and we snap our fingers and we solve the problem of wrongful convictions. But the reality is that the stakes here are incredibly high. And all these guys in these pictures are all guys who were wrongfully convicted. We have the most people in prison of anywhere in the world. We've got around 2 million people in prison. That's up from, less than 1 million 30 years ago. We have the death penalty. These problems fall pretty squarely on the shoulders of people of color who are disproportionately incarcerated in this country. It's an absolutely enormous problem. We know this problem exists. We absolutely have to do everything we can to prevent the wrongful convictions from happening to begin with. So I am really excited to have Fernando come up.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Dr. G. Murley, for arranging this talk. I thank my wife for riding with me along with her niece, who is visiting us from Oklahoma. I thank my defense team for making my freedom possible. Most importantly, I thank God, creator of heaven and earth, for returning my freedom and bringing me back to society as an actually innocent man. This month is Women's History Month, this March. And I think it's appropriate to introduce Harper Lee, the author of To Kill a Mockingbird. A Pulitzer Prize winner, she was a diminutive woman who wrote a giant work of literary greatness in 1960. A year after Queensborough Community College was established. The work that she has introduced to the world of literature has been arguably as impressive as Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, as to the effect it had in considering race relations in the world. The story opens up in the sleepy town of Macomb, Alabama, a place where people have nowhere to go and no money to spend because it takes place throughout the Great Depression in the 1930s. What's important about the story is that it captures the time period that ignited Harper Lee's imagination to write this fictitious yet important work. She was, it said, influenced by the experiences that she saw in the South and throughout, such as the Scottsboro case of 9 young black men accused of raping a white woman and subjected to prison, of Emmett Till, who in 1952, I think, was lynched for having whistled at a white woman. These experiences ignited Harper Lee's imagination into an important work. But truth, despite fiction, is what is stranger, as Mark Twain said. Truth is stronger than fiction because it became my reality. On August 6, 1991, in the summer that was not fully I was arrested in front of my parents' home. I was set to enter the medical profession with hopes and dreams of making my parents proud, of contributing to society, of fulfilling a promise to God that I would atone for my mistakes and imperfections by doing something better. But I'm arrested at gunpoint in front of my Washington Heights home, that metropolitan beehive of Manhattan, as my mother screamed, "Where are you taking my son?" The gun removed, handcuffs were placed on my wrists, so tight that they felt like tourniquets. I was sandwiched between two officers. One burly detective elbowed me and said, "Sorry to ruin your party." Another one, quite curtly, said, "Move this car," in a Bostonian accent. "We got business." I'm sent to the 6th precinct, not knowing what I'm being charged with. Where were you on the night of August 3rd and 4th, 1991? I told the detective, whose second homicide case it was at that point. "Officer, I was celebrating my enrollment in college, driving around with my friends in a car that my father had just recently purchased." Yeah? Did you go to any nightclubs?" "No, sir, I did not." By now, the prosecutor joins us. It's his 3rd homicide case throughout his working moments at that point. 3rd homicide out of an estimated over 2,000 homicides that are occurring in New York City at this point, averaging from 1989 to about 1993, 2,000 every year. So New York is a hotbed of crime. Yet my case, my arrest, is slipping through the cracks, because now I'm told that I'm charged with murder, and my jaw drops. My alibi witnesses come forward to the precinct. Our account dovetails with us having been involved in no violence whatsoever and simply enjoying our night as young men, me being 22 years of age at the point. And I'm shocked when I'm told that I'm being charged with 2nd-degree homicide, and told that if I agree to participate in a lineup, that I can then finally call my mother. Well, I feel I have nothing to hide. But in my youthful ignorance, I am unaware that in the lineup procedure that you saw, in which the individuals are standing, I'm made to sit down. Because at that point, I'm 6'2", approximately 220 pounds, versus a description of the real suspect that I would later learn is 5'10", 165 pounds. Nor am I aware of how the hell I got there in the first place. I would learn after my lineup and hours of interrogation that there had been a shooting at a nightclub in Greenwich Village, Lower Manhattan, in which a 16-year-old who had absconded from his work release program and had went beyond his curfew was at the nightclub. This individual, Ephraim Lopez, 16, had been punched by an individual from Jamaica, Queens, named Raymond Blount, who had arrived with 3 childhood friends of his, best friends. Lopez, incensed, embarrassed, with his eyes swollen, sought retaliation. So he tells his friend inside the nightclub, an individual named Wu Lu from his West 90s neighborhood, along with other individuals who were there at this nightclub, who punched him. Outside the nightclub, the evidence at trial demonstrates, Raymond Blount is walking with his friends, his 3 friends, along with 4 other teenage witnesses. And they are approached on the corner of 13th and University Place. A Jeep suddenly blocks their way. Bottles start flying. Fists fly. And in the process, Raymond Blount is shot dead. As a melee ensues, in which there's total pandemonium, and the violence continues with stabbings, and people being chased under nighttime conditions conducive to bad identification procedures, these 4 witnesses are brought to the precinct and, as I would later learn, subjected to an illegal identification procedure. This illegal identification procedure was one in which they were just given pictures and told to look through the mugshot pictures. They all shared the pictures, talking and joking about the pictures, despite them having been traumatized, hungry, sleepy, and tired, and for many hours in a police precinct. And I was the 3rd person to be chosen as someone who looked like the perpetrator. Mind you, 3 friends of the deceased correctly identify Ephraim Lopez as being responsible for the whole incident beginning. So Ephraim Lopez is arrested in his West 90s neighborhood before I'm arrested. And Ephraim Lopez, from the beginning, in that sultry, hot summer, tells the police and prosecutor in a videotaped confession who was responsible for the crime. Therefore, he knew he was making a purposeful, wrongful identification. But the police and prosecutor didn't care. They had what criminologists and psychologists would call tunnel vision. They weren't receptive to any information coming out in their peripheral vision. Instead, they were focused on me because this 17-year-old young lady had picked my picture and said I looked like the perpetrator. That was enough. That was enough to not allow them to conduct an investigation. So now, as a result, I'm sent to the Manhattan Tombs, a place that's crowded, stinking. It reeks of vomit, urine, and defecation, with humidity in the air rising like one question in my mind: why am I here? I plead not guilty at my arraignment before a judge. And for my staunch position on my innocence, I am sent to Rikers Island in Elmhurst, Queens, the largest penal colony in America, with 14,000 inmates at that time, with a reported estimated violence of 205,000 violent incidents occurring at that point, still simmering from a 1990 riot that had occurred the year before. I'm suddenly thrust into this madhouse, and my aim is to survive, mind my business, and return to my loving family. I believe that the answer, the key to this lock, lies in my belief that if I continue telling the truth, I would be a free man. So as a United States citizen, I exercise my rights to a trial. Because as Advocate Finch says, it is a trial, it is a courtroom where every human being deserves to have a fair opportunity to be heard. So I go in with this ideology, this mysticism of me believing that the American justice system will prevail. But here I am, despite me testifying, despite 3 friends of the deceased testifying at my trial that Fernando Bermudez did not shoot their best friend, despite the fact that I'm not this person who Ephraim Lopez is saying I am found guilty. We, the jury, find the defendant, Fernando Bermudez, guilty of murder. And my body reverberated in angst. I couldn't believe what was happening. These witnesses were lying. They were mistaken. But I'm believing at this point, in 1992 of February, after being found guilty, that an investigation based on the key leads that now emerge from my trial, because the prosecutor, in an illegal process, turned over boxes of evidence right before my trial began. In that connection, along with the key leads that emerged in trial, I believe that a former homicide detective, now turned private investigator, would help find the leads to exonerate me. So he starts beginning an investigation in the West 90s neighborhood. And he discovers that Ephraim Lopez is roommates with Wu Lu, who the police were told was the actual perpetrator, a drug dealer from that neighborhood. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because the judge doesn't want to hear this evidence. He doesn't care to hear that other witnesses are also coming forward and stating that I was not at the club, that I'm not known from the West 90s neighborhood. Evidence, in fact, demonstrates that I'm more than 6 miles up north, as I said in my alibi testimony, which another witness came forward and verified. The judge doesn't want to hear it. And one day from Rikers Island, I'm led in handcuffs, and I almost fall in my seat. But handcuffs quickly pick me back up as I'm sentenced to 23 years to life in New York State maximum security prisons, where I'm stripped of my civilian clothing. My head is shaven. I'm strip searched, having to show my butt to a correctional officer to see if I'm hiding anything in there. Unable to get dressed until he tells me so. I'm placed in a shower with lice spray, doused with water so cold that it feels like an ice pitcher is being poured over me. This is my cold reality. And I'm sinking deeper into the system, stamped 92-83-25. I go from maximum security prison to the next. At Elmira Correctional Facility in 1992 and 1993, I considered suicide for the first time in my life because the noise is unbearable, because the violence there that I witnessed in Rikers Island with people cutting and stabbing each other continues. It affects my mind to see such unnecessary violence against each other. These men, aimless, lost. And despite the delusions I was catching in that 6 by 9 foot cell, a cell so small that throughout my incarceration of over 18 years, I can touch it if I extend my arms and almost if I extend this way with my legs, as if a Superman. That's how small a place I'm living in. But I decide instead to become proactive. I start realizing that I need to educate myself. The aims that I had to enter college must now continue in prison. Therefore, I start educating myself by reading the dictionary and writing attorneys because I have no money to defend myself now. I am destitute. I obtain an attorney, newly minted, at 49 years old, who just earned a law degree, formerly a nun, who left her convent because she believed in the social justice of giving the underprivileged their due. At great peril to herself, she left her Westchester estate, trampled the housing projects, and what she found, with the courage of a Joan of Arc and the voice of a teeny bopper, was a bunch of mixed up teenage witnesses who were yearning to tell the truth as to why they falsely testified against me, including the fact that all of them had criminal records and that 2 of them had open cases dismissed on the eve of my trial if they testified against me. Not to mention the state star witness, who was not charged as an accessory to murder if he testified that I was someone who I was not. So now, I'm back to court before the judge who sentenced me, Justice John Bradley. But the judge doesn't want to hear it. He rejects Mary Ann DeBarry's appeal time and time again. She is the symbolic reflection, in my case, similar to that in To Kill a Mockingbird. Because as Atticus Finch in the movie shoots that rabid dog, she is the first one to symbolically, literally, to stand up and to shoot the rabid dog of injustice in my case. But even though she misses her target by failing an appeal, she continues. But unfortunately, I need new attorneys now, because now the new millennium is approaching, and all I have to my name in terms of accomplishment, because I can't get my freedom, is a college degree, an associate's degree, which I earned in business, which allowed me to imagine now how I can support myself to obtain a new attorney. That's because my family needed $15,000, because my next level of resort of relief was the federal courts, where I would submit a writ of habeas corpus to attack the constitutionality of my conviction, stating that it was against the United States Constitution. What would I do now? In the year 2000, many things were happening. It was the year when George Bush was either going to become president or became president, and had yet to be inaugurated. It was a year when George Bush had misspoke, fumbled with words, and said, our friends from other countries will be the peacemakers, and America, this great country, will be the pacemakers. But besides his misspeaking, I had to speak correctly of what I needed, and that was my freedom. And so I devised an idea, because my parents took a loan, yet couldn't afford the entire attorney fee. I began purchasing clothes wholesale, socks, sweatpants, shoes, sneakers, underwears, and I started retailing it in prison. I created my own market, which now brought me levels of cigarettes, stamps, and many other items which I was able to send to my wife, who would liquidate them in the corner bodega store, and so that therefore I could support her. Because now I'm a married man with one child and another on the way. And I need to support her, because my wife is almost near homelessness at times, in the dire straits that she finds herself in. So we're surviving by selling clothes. I'm surviving by continuously writing letters to anyone who would help me across continents, because I need a dream team of people to help me. The odds are stacked against me. So in retaining this attorney, it seems like it's a turning point in my life, because for the first time, out of so many denied appeals at this point by the state court judge, a federal judge opens my case. He says, bring forward all the witnesses to hear what they have to say. And so in 2002, exactly a year to the day when my daughter Carissa is born and she's celebrating her 1-year-old birthday, a beautiful little girl who I baptized with tears of joy and appreciation, I enter federal court, handcuffed. And I hear these witnesses, one by one, take an oath as to why they were coerced, threatened, and pressured into falsely identifying me. Toward the end of the procedure, Ephraim Lopez himself, arrested throughout the years that I'm incarcerated on unrelated matters, shuffles by me handcuffed, led by federal marshals. And he stops and he says, I'm so sorry for what I did to you. And my lawyers look at me and say, well, what do you think about that, Fernando? I said, I forgive him in the name of Jesus Christ. And they just said, well, whatever. But for me, it meant everything to hear the beginning of apologies. And I go back to Shawongo Correctional Facility in upstate to a who, what, when, where, and why of questions pelting me from all the inmates in galleries. Everyone wants to know what happened. The Daily News reports 5 witnesses recant. I'm hoping it's the dawning of a new day, as I'm working now in the civilian office with a trusted position in which I'm the only inmate in that particular maximum security prison to work in a civilian office, trusted to handle the financial analysis using computers for a food service program in the kitchen. But in 2004, unfortunately, the rude awakening once again comes knocking. When a priest calls me to his chapel and says, "Sit down, son, I have some bad news." And I learned that the federal judge had denied my federal appeal. I needed psychological counseling immediately, because in that 6 by 9 foot cell, the walls seemed like they were talking to me. Harper Lee, in her book, demonstrates the mockingbird as a symbolic figure in that it is innocent. The mockingbird is innocent, Atticus Finch tells his children while eating supper, because the mockingbird, all it does is sing. You can kill as many blue jays as you want, he tells them with a gun that Jem received, but do not kill a mockingbird. The system was taking its toll on me now. The innocence that I was experiencing, the naivete, was removed with the disillusion that I may very well be spending the rest of my life in prison as an innocent man. I had to continue fighting. I needed that level of hope, which, as a coming-of-age story that To Kill a Mockingbird is, needed to involve my life with the level of hope that coming of age does not remove. And so I continued writing. Because now, unless I create a way, I won't have a way. And what's good about the federal judge's ruling, despite it failing to overturn my conviction, is that that federal judge ruled in my favor that the witnesses were exposed to an illegal identification procedure which should not have occurred. So we used that as evidence, as ammunition for the next proceeding, my 11th appeal. By now, my resolve is such that I've attracted Court TV, which had aired my story nationally and had ignited rallies in Lower Manhattan in front of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. MSNBC aired it nationally, creating more supporters, even donations by mail to my wife to now support our 3rd child, Fernando Bermudez III, my only boy who's 6 today. And the New York Times now gets involved, plants my case front page. Unknown to myself or any of my current defense team, the district attorney's office is now doing what it failed to do and admits to have not having done throughout the procedures, i.e., it is now investigating. But what they're trying to do is use the key leads that they learned about this woo-loo and connect it with me. But all of that backfires because as their investigators from the district attorney's office span out throughout the country to find this woo-loo, they find out, as our evidence was already demonstrating, that woo-loo had fled New York right after the murder in the summer of 1991, that he's living under an alias, hopscotching in different states, that he's been arrested several times, and that the alibi that he proposes as to where he was in Kentucky at that time is like Swiss cheese. full of holes. But none of this evidence is revealed to us. They keep it quiet on the hush-hush. And so I'm at Sing Sing Correctional Facility in 2007 now, starting to finish my bachelor's degree in behavioral science, when I obtained a new attorney. This new attorney, another newly minted attorney in her late 40s, which demonstrates that it's never too late, comes forward and says, we can use this magistrate federal judge's decision in your favor. How are we going to do this? How? She says, I can't do it alone. I need a legion of attorneys. So she obtains her law professor husband. She obtains pro bono counsel from Washington, D.C. She obtains law firms from Park Avenue. She obtains the help of New York's Innocence Project along with New Jersey's Centurion Ministries. And together, in 2008, we enter state court again. 11 witnesses are in my favor. This time, I have a new judge, Justice John Bradley. I should say, excuse me, Justice John Cataldo. And Justice John Cataldo is incensed because the prosecution, up until this point, has asked for more time to investigate. And they're continuously trying to incriminate me however they can. But after a while, Justice John Cataldo says no more. And at that point, a breakthrough ensues. The state, for the first time, admits that its state star witness had committed perjury. This was a breakthrough, a reversible situation in and of itself to overturn my conviction. At the same time, I'm in the prison yard when my lawyers come to visit me. We sit in the small, cramped, dingy prison visiting room at Sing Sing Correctional Facility. And in the summer of 2009, right when the state court judge orders my proceedings to begin that September, it's communicated to me that I'm offered a plea bargain. In short, plead guilty to manslaughter, which is a reduced form of murder, rather than the homicide charge that I had, and that I could go free. I left that prison room in disbelief. After 18 years, you have the audacity to offer me such a Faustian bargain, which is why I rejected that deal with the devil. Because I wasn't going to sell my soul to my children. I wasn't going to lie to them. I wasn't going to give up the fight. I was willing instead to take the risk, which to me was a leap of faith. Because I knew, I believed that God was my best attorney, that God would see me through with the defense team I had, the alliance, and what made me survive, being physically attacked in prison, humiliated and deprived for so many years. I went to court, and everything went off without a hitch. From Rikers Island, the place where I had started at, that zoo of madness, I was there witnessing everything, as if an Alexis de Tocqueville, whose Democracy in America made observations in the prison system in the 19th century. My observations continued with the same reality that there was self-destruction occurring as it was in 1991 and 92. But my mission was to stay out of trouble. I would go and learn the computer and work on my case. And it paid off, because a month later, I was returned back to court. And the judge silenced everyone. There was rapt attention, so palpable that you can hear breathing. News reporters were furiously scribbling. Cameras were rolling because they were allowed in the courtroom. And the judge said, as I held my breath, I hereby declare you actually innocent. and a punctuating sigh of relief resonated throughout the courtroom. He added that the prosecutor knew and should have known that it was relying on perjured testimony. That two, that the state's star witness had committed perjury and that the state for the first time had acknowledged it. Three, that my illegal identification procedures should never have occurred and contaminated the very essence of my identification. All wrapped up into an actual innocence ruling, which made New York State legal history, because it essentially received the same consideration and recognition as a DNA-based exoneration. So overwhelming was my evidence of innocence. So much so that the judge apologized to me in that courtroom. Soon thereafter, I'm released into the loving arms of my family. Outside the courtroom, my supporters and newscasters, the crush of reporters, questioning everybody. They're all dancing, and they're all waving free Fernando Bermudez t-shirts, which had been used throughout the years to gain attraction. My wife says, "Thank God there's a Jesus." My mother says, I'm so happy my son's home." There was tears of joy coming down like a cloudy day when the sun was shining resplendently. I immediately am sent back to Sing Sing for my release. And there, I'm told that I'm being released because paperwork had to be finalized. My family's celebrating, but I'm still locked up for the moment. But I'm sent back to Sing Sing, about to be released. That's exactly what I'm saying. What's going on here? ¿Qué pasa? And so I give all my stuff away. Okay, you're being released. Great, take these handcuffs off, you know? And the doors of Sing Sing, in unprecedented fashion, open up Hollywood style. Everybody's clapping, and the news reporters are all there filming and just surrounding me as if I'm a UFO specimen who descended from another planet, and indeed I have. Because prison is another world, culture, subculture. And I quickly took back a sweater when I realized that I needed to get dressed in civilian clothes. It was all wrinkled because it was stashed at the bottom of my property, wrinkled, stored there for months as I'm in Rikers Island waiting for this case to resolve itself. And I put it on and I leave, and the reporters are filming, and I go and I kiss my wife. And I kiss her. And I tell the newscasters and reporters, please pardon my wrinkled appearance. What counts now is that my problems are ironed out. I am whisked away in a car. My attorneys, my private investigator. I go immediately to Connecticut. The world looks so different just being in a car. I'm given a cell phone, this small, which was this big when I first went to prison. I'm holding it upside down, talking to my attorney in Washington, D.C. I don't even know, it sounds so strange hearing him that way. I pick up my kids. My kids run down the stairs. My daughter Shayla, age 18 at the time. My daughter Carissa, approximately about 5.5, 6 years old, I think, and whose birthday wish on November 7th, a few days before my release, was that her dad come home. My son jumps into my arm. I'm wobbling under the weight of them. We drive back to New York, the New York Times following us. The camera in my grill as I eat my first Big Mac. Man, it tastes good. Woo! And I go back to my neighborhood of Washington Heights, where I had been snatched up from, where I was forced to grow in this coming-of-age story in the same way that To Kill a Mockingbird is a coming-age story. I go to the neighborhood. It's nighttime now. People are on the fire skates, in the streets. The roads are closed. The two streets are closed. People are yelling in the Dominican community, justicia, libertad, verdad. Justicia, verdad, libertad, justice, truth, freedom. You hear the merengue. People eating chimichurris. I'm like, yeah, let me get one of those. I come out. I'm shaking hands with people I don't even know. They're putting $100 bills in my hands. I'm like, okay, cool. You know, putting it all away, it's just great. Go upstairs, I eat a home-cooked meal. My first meal. Comparable to my wife's delicious cooking. And I'm back in society now. But what I've taken with me, after leaving all those draft bags of property, is things that I don't realize. Put aside technology, which I'm all thumbs about. I'm dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, as a psychologist would diagnose me. I'm dealing with hyperventilation, palpitations of the heart, in which I'm waking up in the middle of the night as I'm still an inmate being counted for the prison census. I'm so shook that we have a little dog who I'm catching an attitude with because he's barking and yelping throughout the night. It's a little white, cute dog. He looks like Toto from The Wizard of Oz. Cutie, 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 and when I go, he bites my hand. Okay, but he's cute, and then my daughter loves him. Yet, when I go walk him, because by now it's cold, I'm getting paranoid feelings of still being watched, as if there's a gun tower in my old Connecticut neighborhood, as if I'm still in a prison yard, unable to leave the parameters and control of the conditioning that I lived so long with. So I continued seeking counseling and therapy to help me overcome this. I got back on my feet and was able to complete my bachelor's degree just this past December. Straight A's. Today, I devote my life to helping to work and improve the system in its imperfections. I work on being a father to my children, to be the moral backbone of my family, like Atticus Finch, who told his children that when they look in his eyes, he wants to be able to look right back at them. Because I am an example to my children as to how I conduct myself in my freedom and through the fight that I've taught my children. The lesson that I'm trying to essentially imbue them with is that there is a level of goodness amid the evil that exists in the world. Scout, Jem's sister, who's a very unusual character throughout To Kill a Mockingbird, had to learn this. Her innocence was replaced with the realities of learning about what life is really like in seeing Tom Robinson falsely accused of rape. She's an unusual girl who fights boys in the schoolyard, as the book illustrates. She puts aside the frilly clothing of the prim and proper South at the time, rejecting it, basically saying, I don't want to wear that. That feels like a pink cotton penitentiary closing in on me. But yet, she has the tenacity of a young girl who is beyond her years, beyond her intelligence. As her, Jem, and Dill creep into Boo Radley's home to get a look at this mysterious person who ultimately helps save their life. A reclusive man who had been harmed. Another Mockingbird in this story who had, in perhaps his prudence, moved away from society in order to protect himself from its grim realities. But I tell my children otherwise. I tell my children that the world is good but that you must also confront the evil that's in this world, which is why I take my children on speaking engagements across the country with my wife managing. I tell them that you too must be inspired, whether it's by a story such as To Kill a Mockingbird or something else that can cause you to do the right thing when everyone says, why? To Kill a Mockingbird to date has inspired countless attorneys because it demonstrates courage, compassion, sympathy, and understanding. Scott Thoreau himself, a famous lawyer and author of a book, said that he thanks Harper Lee for that book because it's Atticus Finch who propelled him to do the right thing in his legal profession and to devote his life to fighting the underprivileged, like Tom Robinson. And this is what I tell my children. I tell them, as Atticus Finch told his children, that there's a place where doing the right thing may not make you popular, but having a good conscience is what counts. Doing the right thing regardless, even if you fail, because what's important is that you try. And I think that these lessons that I can combine with my life, along with your stories, and whatever you're doing in school, can also connect with the elements in To Kill a Mockingbird, with the realities of the race and class distinctions that occur in our world today. But what you can all do as individuals in overcoming the adversities. It's what I tell my children, and it's what I encourage you all to do. As our converged paths today diverge in the different endeavors and aims in life that we all have, I encourage you to strive for academic excellence. It can make a difference in your life. It's what made a difference in my life. It's what will allow me, as I continue overcoming everything, and as I prepare to testify this afternoon before the Connecticut State Senate, that I can look my children in the eye and they can look me back. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer some. I believe we have some time left. And yes.
Did the system ever did a drug test on the witness?
A drug test? Well, he was, by his own admission, he was an admitted, I should say, habitual marijuana user. The police and prosecutor knew that, but they didn't consider that as to anything that would, I think, be frowned upon as to his credibility. They just plowed ahead with my case. Yes?
Are there inmates that you came across while you were there that you try to help out now?
Absolutely. To this date, despite, you would think, the reluctance for someone who experienced prison to go back, I do go back. Because there's a lot of men there, good men, who really helped me when I was very, very depressed. Whether it was exercising, whether it was at church, whether it was learning the law in the law library. And I go visit them today, and some men are innocent. And I'm actually trying to advocate for some men who are still in there, who haven't proved their innocence, or some men who are actually about to be released and either may not prove their innocence or just need help in their marriage. Because my wife and I help counsel couples who are released from prison as to how to overcome and maintain their marriages upon release. Yes? Absolutely.
So now it's no problem finding a sustainable career as a
Well, I mean, I continue doing the public speaking circuit. That's basically how I'm supporting myself. And I'm a student. I'm going to pursue my master's degree now with an opportunity to teach at a university. I've had 2 law school offers, but I declined to become a lawyer, not because I don't like them. I don't agree with Shakespeare when he said, the first thing we'll do is kill lawyers. I don't agree with that. But instead, I like to teach, and that's something I prefer to do. Plus, it's in Connecticut, so it'll be more local for me. You're welcome. Yes?
Did the state pay you any compensation?
Not yet. That's in the works. I have several lawsuits in the works right now, making their way, and I'll leave it up to the jury and the good people of the court to decide on that amount. Yes?
I have a loved one myself in prison, and I feel, speaking with him, we had a DNA issue that was back in 1988 when we were living in Pennsylvania, and initially they didn't even test the DNA of the T-shirt, and it was a weapon used against my mother, and so basically, my father's been in there serving his 26th year of a life sentence, and like we don't have much money, so like what, aside from the Innocence Project, like what other recommendations would you have for someone to look for help?
Well, I think that you need to continue writing to as many people as possible, try to obtain local counsel, and that way they can be a point person to reaching out to nonprofit organizations, which help the innocent, because oftentimes the nonprofit organizations, those innocence projects, offer overwhelmed. And it takes patience to be involved in this, and you may do very well by getting a local counselor to help you to serve as a point person, a spokesperson in between these groups. Sometimes that gives a little bit of extra consideration as a communication, as opposed to you just doing it yourself. Yes?
I'm not sure if you actually said if the person who was actually responsible for that shooting, did they ever get arrested, like, for doing that?
That's the tragedy of this case. Not only has the victim's family not received justice, nor the deceased, nor myself, because I bore the brunt of that burden as well. The victim, of course, more than me. But no, he has not. And the state knows who committed the crime. The evidence is all there. And even the judge in his ruling said that the state knows who committed the crime and it's up for them to pursue the matter. And to date, they never pursued it, nor did they ever appeal my case. They agreed with the judge's ruling by not appealing it. And it's a shame because society loses in so many ways. This individual, in any wrongful conviction case, because in my case, there was no physical forensic evidence. My case was a non-DNA case. But in any wrongful conviction case, the tragedy of it is that the real perpetrator remains at large, capable of committing another crime, which in some instances has happened, much to society's detriment. Yes?
So you're saying they know his known aliases, and they know where he is, they're just kind of calling it, all right, you're out, and that's it?
Yes, they've let that slide, and, it's a shame. Yes?
I don't understand why you got arrested. I don't understand that.
Okay, I got arrested because I was misidentified as a person because somebody said I looked like the person. And so, based on that 17-year-old young lady saying I resembled the perpetrator, after she selected two other individuals who were either the perpetrator or were, she claimed, at the scene, the police just ran with that.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yes?
You indicated that at your lowest you considered committing suicide. Could you share with us, since you've been released, what has been the best, what has been the highlight for you?
With pleasure. The best basically has been just being back in society and having that burden lifted off of me, coupled with engaging in the responsibilities that I tried to carry out while incarcerated, and that is being a husband and father to my children. The best parts of that is being able to take my children to school every day. Today, for the first time, and perhaps it should be off record, I took my kids to school and I was wearing my boxers. It's the first time I've ever done that in my 2 years of release. But I'm starting to feel more freer now. I don't think I'll do it in my birthday suit ever, because I never got out the car and I never would in my boxers. Please, I'm not on indecent exposure here. But it felt good to do that. And yesterday I went to the Red Box to rent the movie out. I finally got the trick of that. And I went in my pajamas. So, I'm stepping all out now. I'm no longer concerned with being busy in a department store or being scared to cross the street. I am concerned about overeating. It's something that I've done time and time again. I mean, food was always a big word to me, especially in prison when I would imagine the smells of food dancing before me like a belly dancer. So tempting they were. But now I get to eat, and I have to do a lot of running as a result to assuage the cognitive dissonance. Yes?
I'm kind of curious as to how did you and your wife meet if you were in jail?
Yes. It's an element of a Harlequin romance, subject for a future book. And basically, we met in the early stages of my incarceration. She had saw me on television. My case had always been publicized and was always in the media in a positive way. I had journalists joining my cause as early as I was arrested, and they never stopped fighting on my behalf. I've always received good press, and it happened that she was living in Oklahoma at the time, and she saw me in the early years of my incarceration, and we met, fell in love, and had beautiful children together. And she continues to be the strongest level of support, you know, and she's just... Yes?
What do you think is the biggest flaw in the legal system?
Well, one of the biggest flaws basically is, intrinsically, it's that the law is a human instrument. Let's begin with that, in considering that because it's man-made, human-made, I should say, it's subject to imperfections because humans are imperfect. So it can never be perfect. But what compounds that is when you have a system in which it's so difficult to admit that you made a mistake, knowing that inherently it's an imperfect system. And what I mean by that is that once a conviction is secured, it is so very difficult, as Olga pointed out, to overturn that conviction. So many procedural hurdles. There's the idea of finality in the law where people just want that closure. It's over, done with, let's move on. Vengeance or retaliation or deterrence has been meted. But mistakes happen, as illustrated by over 289 DNA-based exonerations, and much more non-DNA. And so that's a difficulty. The other difficulty is that in many of the early stages of wrongful convictions, and of course they continue today, but in the lump sum of wrongful convictions which have occurred, mostly which come from the 80s and 90s, you had what's called best practices in effect, which could perhaps serve as an extra level of protection from people getting wrongfully convicted. That is to say, people at that point, for example, myself, I was made to sit down in a lineup. Or the witnesses, by their own account and the detective's own account, stated that he told the witnesses when they saw a photo array, tell me who you think is responsible, rather than what is considered a best practice to instead say, I'm about to show you a photo array with 6 photos, tell me if you think a person may be involved. He may or may not be there, as opposed to, tell me who is responsible. These sort of things were occurring in them years, and now the reform, statewide, countrywide, are helping to at least provide an extra firewall of protection. But it's not a given that a wrongful conviction will not occur again. These are some of the problems. You're welcome. Any other questions?
You're very handsome.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I didn't get too attacked in prison because I had some trouble there. Yes?
I work at Rikers Island. I've been working there for 15 years. I'm not an officer, but I work in the school system. I'm a civilian. So I lose my voice. We work with adolescent males from 16 to 18 years old. And unlike a lot of my coworkers who I'm ashamed to say, well, they go in jail, they did this, I think, no. You have to give each and every person the benefit of the doubt. I have 2 children. My oldest son, he went to central booking twice. I got him out of there and I sent him out of state, New Jersey. My youngest son came close in Nassau County. Although I'm not an officer, I have many of my friends are officers. And I've asked them sometimes what's it like in those dorms. We don't want to tell you that. We don't want to share that. So, to be honest with you, I don't want to know. I'm sorry you went through that. I give you white flag credit. I don't personally want to know what happened there. The only thing I wanted to ask you is, would you be willing to come? I know Rikers Island is a hellhole, and I work there. I don't want to work there sometimes. Sometimes I want to be there because I know some things that I see from a civilian's point of view and from my eyesight. Would you be willing to come back there and speak to the adolescent males who are very young, very impressionable, and some of these people, these guys, when I say kids, don't come from good homes, broken homes, homeless, living in cars, group homes, whatever the fact, the story is. I was lucky, I came from a solid family, a very supportive family like yourself, who happen to really like me. I don't know what it's like for these kids who come from the South, Brooklyn, South Bronx, whatever, and to come back to have to sell drugs or whatever so their mothers don't prostitute themselves. Because I spoke, even as a secretary, I've spoken to some of these students for the 15 years I've worked with. What I want to know is, would you be willing to come back there to just speak to the students? I mean, I would have to arrange with the principal or my assistant principal. And it'd be up to you, of course, if you would be willing to do this for these students here, who, for the most part, as you know, because you've been there, 1 out of every 3 of them, every 6 months, comes back to Rikers Island. Because they have pretty much nowhere else to go. They don't have a stable home. I think it could be all environmental. I think it's the home from which, not in your situation, from the home in which they came, broken or whatever the situation. So I think it might be good for these students, the young men in particular, to see a man like yourself who came from this situation. And so you could just speak to them in a very positive, because I think you're a very positive person like I am. Just speak to them in a very positive, motivational way. And hopefully somewhere along the way, some of these students will come back to Rikers Island. They'll find somewhere else to go or decide. I think that they would benefit from vocational programs. That's my feeling.
Well, I can tell you emphatically yes, that I would come because this is what my life's devotion is now. My passion, my aim, my oath is to now devote my life to preventing what happened to me from happening to anyone else. Because we have a problem in America. The problem in America is that 30% of all Americans before the age of 23 are arrested. 30% of all American youth up until the age 23 are arrested, have an arrest record, have been to prison, and so forth. That's a problem. That's a problem that needs to be addressed through dysfunction of family, through the idea of bad choices, through the peer pressures that exist in the inner cities, through addiction, through racism in the system, which I can speak upon at length, and it's just not the forum. So I'd be certainly willing to do that, and it's what I'm doing. In fact, I am set to meet the mayor next week to connect with him as to how I'm going to help the youth in his district. So it is my life's, and please see me afterward.
Okay, thanks very much. That's really all we have the time for today. I want to thank Ms. Akselrod and Mr. Bermudez. Thank you so much for being with us today. Pleasure to have you here. We hope we can get you back again to speak to our students. I hope you appreciate the freedoms that you do have, because your life can change in an instant. That's what you heard today. Keep your minds open, please. Mr. Bermudez did refer to the text. You're here to learn. We have so much to share with you, so we hope that you keep your minds open and learn from everything, from what's going on in your classroom to the clubs, to the events that we hold on the campus. Life is precious. Please enjoy every day. I want to thank you for being with us today. And please join us for the rest of our events. We have an event this afternoon at 4:10. Boo-hoo, a conversation on Boo Bradley and Statement to Kill a Mockingbird. That's at 4:10 in room number 14. We have Leaping Off the Page, Part 2. If only I knew then what I know now, examining the differences between the novel and the film. That will be tomorrow in this room at 3:10. And on Friday at 10:30 in the morning, We have To Kill a Mockingbird, Child Development in the Midst of Turmoil, and our own Dr. Jeffrey Jankowski will be discussing how the events of the text affected the children in the story. So thank you again, and have a wonderful day.